Hello and welcome to my weekly best of 3 sideboard guide. This week, the Esper Midrange won the vote just barely over Azorius Soldiers. So we're going to be looking at the tournament winner from week 12 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And just really quickly, we'll go over the deck and the sideboard that they chose, and then we'll do the analysis. And so we've got like Disruption with Cut Down and Go for the Throat, Spot Removal, Deep Cavern Bat to affect our opponent's spot removal, Make Disappear for counter spells for like Sunfall. Fairy Mastermind works so whenever your opponent draws a second card, you draw a card, and there's kind of a draw card theme going on here because of Rafine. Whenever you attack, target attacking creature connives. And connive is where you draw a card, and then if you discard a non-land card, your creature gets +1/+1. And so you can use this to get some evasive flyers like the Deep Cavern Bat, Mastermind, and Rafine that are attacking in the air, and you can pump like a Dinnick to race them with a large lifelinker, or you can just pump one of your flyers for a lethal threat. This one's running 2 Tishana's Tidebinders in the main, which can disrupt certain key cards and triggered or activated abilities. Then we've got Wedding Announcement, which is really great for drawing cards and creating 1/1 tokens. We've got the Virtue of Loyalty, which kind of helps pump the general board that is getting bigger off of cards like Lord Skitter, spawning a 1/1 rat every turn. And then we've got 2 copies of the Wandering Emperor for some nice removal against your opponent's threats. Then just a whole bunch of land fixing to make Esper the 3-color work. As far as the sideboard goes, we've got 1 copy of Cut Down, 3 copies of Destroy Evil, 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke, 1 copy with Anoint with Affliction, 1 Negate, 1 Parasitic Grasp, 2 Knockout Blows, 2 Lauren of the Third Path, and Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal. So with that, let's hop into the analysis and kind of what I, how my data-based technique says, some insights there. So the reason why I started doing this was because when I was looking online, a lot of the sideboard guides were usually behind paywalls, and a lot of them were based off of just experience playing the deck, which is fine, that's how it used to be done. But now we have access to data, and so I'm going to try to create an approach to building a sideboard strategy based off of using tracker data. And so far, it's been a little bit of an exploration. So this isn't something to say that this is like this is the absolute right way. This is just to try to help give you insights and help you build your own sideboard strategy. So let me know what's matching up with what you've been doing and what's not. This is a work in progress, and trying to kind of tweak my technique here to perfect it without playing thousands of matches of the same, of the one deck, because I've got to do one of these every week. So if we start here, what I'm going to do is just go down the list of the most common matchups according to MTG Goldfish. So the top performing cards here for the Esper Midrange against the Mirror are Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, Destroy Evil, and Dinnick, Lord Skitter, Go for the Throat, Cut Down, Rafine, and Deep Cavern Bat. So from here, Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal is one of the cards in the sideboard, so you're definitely going to want to bring that one in. The 3 copies of Destroy Evil are also in the sideboard, so you're going to be wanting to bring those in. And then we could bring in like 1 more copy of Cut Down. Now, as we continue down the list, we can kind of see what some of the worst performers are in the list. So we've got Make Disappear, Wedding Announcement, Virtue of Loyalty, Lauren of the Third Path, Fairy Mastermind, Tishana's Tidebinder, and then we hit into a lack of data. So this one I thought was kind of interesting because Lauren of the Third Path I thought was going to be particularly good to bring in against Esper Midrange for the same reason that Destroy Evil was performing very well. So that one kind of caught my attention, surprised me a little bit. So then we've got Parasitic Grasp, Knockout Blow, Anoint with Affliction, Negate, and Disdainful Stroke that just don't have enough data for this specific matchup. So one of the things that we can do to kind of extend when there's not enough data is to look at what does the data say about the archetype in general? So these are the top performing cards within all Esper midrange decks, not just the one that I was looking at the beginning, and specifically against the mirror match. So this is a good way to see what options could be included in the sideboard or into the main deck list that are not being included currently. And so we can see here, top of the list, this would be a great matchup against the mirror because of how much Esper Midrange is drawing cards. Bring in Shieldred, the Apocalypse, to make them pay 2 life every time that they draw a card. So this could be a good option. I've seen it come and go throughout the weeks of whether or not you're going to want to actually run Shieldred. So if you're struggling against the a bunch of other Esper midrange decks, then you will want to look to like bring in a copy of Shieldred. Interesting too, we've got Malcolm, the Alluring Scoundrel, which is the 2/1 flash flyer. Invasion of Amonkhet, which we have not seen for quite some time, but could be an interesting one because of how it attacks your opponent's hand and makes them discard while drawing you cards. And then we've got Subterranean Schooner, which some lists of Esper midrange do run the Subterranean Schooner. This one decided to ditch it. And then the other thing that you can do is look at the top performing cards against Esper midrange across all archetypes. And so this one is a nice way to look at some of the sideboard options that might have too low of data. So top of the list here, we've got Anoint with Affliction. We've got the Destroy Evils that we saw in the top performing list. And then Lord Skitter, Fairy Mastermind, Lauren of the Third Path, Aclazotz, Tishana's Tidebinder, and Rafine Scheming Seer. So one issue with using all of the archetypes is sometimes these cards are doing different things in other archetypes. So this one is always like, take it with a little bit like a grain of salt, right? But the Anoint with Affliction being at the top of the list, I think, is worth noting and probably worth bringing in over, say, like the one copy of the Cut Down. So with this, my suggestion is to bring in the one copy of Aclazotz, the 3 copies of Destroy Evil, the 1 copy of Anoint with Affliction, and bring out 2 Tidebinders and the 3 Fairy Masterminds. And once again, missing options just for later review, Shieldred, Malcolm, the Invasion of Amonkhet, and the Schooner. So Aclazotz's Deepest Betrayal is a just nice mid-range threat. You know, it gives you a flying lifelinker that attacks your opponent's hand and helps you kind of swing the card advantage in your favor. Then we've got Destroy Evil, which is really good for hitting their enchantments. So you can destroy their wedding announcements as well as the Virtue of Loyalty, and is particularly good at sniping Rafine because it destroys power, toughness, not rather than power 4 or greater. So as long as you're okay with paying the ward, you can snipe the enemy's Rafine. And then Anoint with Affliction gives us some nice targeted removal, just like Go for the Throat. There's not like a recurring threat that needs exile over, like there is Dinnik, which has the ability to come back from the graveyard. So Anoint with Affliction is particularly nice for sniping Dinnik. And then we've got Tishana's Tidebinder and Fairy Mastermind, which I thought were kind of interesting to see at the bottom of the list. Tishana's Tidebinder I thought would have been particularly good at countering Rafine's triggered ability and making Rafine into nothing. However, when I have been playing this deck, I have found that it doesn't work out as well as I thought it would be, because like the Rafine connive strategy isn't necessary to win with the Esper midrange deck. And this one, a lot, you know, I think it comes more down to the card advantage, and you know, same thing with the Fairy Mastermind. Drawing you a card when they connive, I thought would be good, but the data here suggests that it, you know, is the bottom performer. So second most common matchup is Mono Red Aggro, and this is another one where we can see Aclazotz's Deepest Betrayal at the top of the list. Then we've got Anoint with Affliction, Dinnik, Virtue of Loyalty, Wedding Announcement, Fairy Mastermind, Rafine, Go for the Throat. And near the, you know, closer to the bottom, we've got the Deep Cavern Bat, Cut Down, Lord Skitter, Sewer King, Make It Disappear, Tishana's Tidebinder, Destroy Evil, and Lauren of the Third Path. And then we hit into the same problem of not having enough data. So Parasitic Grasp and Knockout Blow, Negate, and Disdainful Stroke all don't have enough data. If we look at alternative strategies, here's one that I thought was kind of cute, was bringing in copies of Rune Lurker Bat. And personally, just because like I like to explore new things, one of the things that I've noticed in the doing this process is that the knockout blow does not seem to be particularly necessary in the sideboard. So it could be fun to replace it with a Rune Lurker Bat, because knockout blow is specifically brought in against mono red. And so actually having the flying threat that can grow into a lifelinker with Rafine, just like Dinnik, might actually help stabilize more so than the knockout blows, which I thought was kind of like, I haven't really seen that being explored. So I think that could be kind of cool. And then also we see another Invasion of Amonkhet here near the top of the list. So that could be another missing option. That could be an interesting sideboard option to bring in. As far as all of the archetypes against mono red, using the list from the Esper Midrange, we can see that the top of the list is Lord Skitter, Rafine, Akhlazot's, Wedding Announcement, Cutdown, Dinnik, Fairy Mastermind, and Tishana's Tidebinder. So from this, I think that you can say that you should bring in the one copy of the Akhlazot's from the sideboard. If you do get to your 5-drops and you get to slam your flying lifelinker, it can really help you stabilize against the mono red aggro. Bring in one copy of Anoint with Affliction, as well as one copy of Cutdown. And we've seen this before, just like single point removal against mono red really helps you survive their early pressure. And then bring out the one copy of Lauren and the 2 copies of the Tidebinder. There's not a whole lot of like Lauren can end up killing a Kumano faces Kakazan, but you're kind of paying the price of having a low statted creature that doesn't block very well. And same thing with Tidebinder. The flash to bring in to block it to just like die is not particularly good. And then yeah, if you want to explore some alternative options, I think Rune Lurker Bat is kind of an interesting one, as well as Invasion of Amonkhet. And notably, Knockout Blow is something that you bring in typically against mono red specifically. And regardless of my techniques, I was not able to find anything that really suggested that Knockout Blow is performing particularly well in Esper Midrange. And so this could be an interesting one to kind of explore replacing in the sideboard. Okay, so yeah, so Akhlazot's is just a flying lifelinker, gives us some nice stabilization against mono red. Anoint with Affliction is particularly good for hitting like Squee, because Squee is another one that's a recurring threat that if they have the cards in their graveyard, they can exile it to bring it back. That's a particularly good one to exile. And then Cutdown, just bringing in as many of those as we can to attack their early drops and survive into the late game. And then Lauren of the Third Path, a 2/1 body on a 3 is just not worth being able to snipe their Kumano, and depending on play versus draw, you may not even get the opportunity to destroy it before it's done everything. And so you just like, I think we can do better than that. And the same thing with Tishana's Tidebinder. A 3/2 flash for 3 is just we need better blockers. We need better board presence against mono red, because this just dies to shock or play with fire. As far as domain goes, we've got Tishana's Tidebinders, top of the list, Lauren of the Third Path, Destroy Evil, Fairy Mastermind, Deep Cavern Bat, Cut Down, Make Disappear, Rafine. And we start to see this one's more of a tougher matchup for Esper Midrange, and the developing your board and getting it nice and big and juicy with Wedding Announcement, and then having your opponent just destroy everything with Sunfall doesn't work particularly well for this matchup. And yeah, so then we've got Akhlazot's, Deepest Betrayal, Go for the Throat, Virtue of Loyalty, Dinnik, Lord Skitter, Wedding Announcement, and then we hit into the no data with Parasitic Grasp, Knockout Blow, Anoint with Affliction, Negate, and Disdainful Stroke. So looking at alternative Esper Midrange decks against the domain matchup, we do have a couple of cards missing here. So this list is not running Gix, Yawgmoth, Praetor, which could be a good option against the domain lists. It's not running Urtai Resurrected, which can also be a good one to bring in for this matchup. Malcolm, Alluring Scoundrel, as well as the Subterranean Schooner. And the vehicle works nicely to still have some sort of threat after the sun falls, because it doesn't get exiled along with the board. And then as far as all of the archetypes go, we can see the top of the list here, Negate. And this is a classic spell that you you bring in copies of Negate in your sideboard specifically for Domain to block their Sunfalls. And then we've got Tishana's Tidebinder, which works particularly nice against the Atraxas. Being able to just block Atraxa's ability makes it so that they just played a 7/7 that doesn't have flying and lifelink and all of that. So Tishana's Tidebinder works pretty well there, as well as to negate some of their other enter the battlefield effects. Like even if you're just using this to flash it in to stop a Topiary Stomper, kind of stops their ramp tempo into their late game. Fairy Mastermind gives us some card draw whenever they're drawing off of like up the beanstalk. Then we're kind of like trying to keep it on parity with drawing with them. Make Disappear is just like negate, very good to have the counter spells against Domain. Destroy Evil could be an interesting option to bring in to destroy their up the beanstalks. Anoint with Affliction, Dinnick, and Rafine start getting there near the bottom of the list. So with this, we can kind of be like, all right, let's bring in the other copy of the Tishana's Tidebinder in the sideboard. Let's bring in the 2 copies of Lauren of the Third Path and the 3 copies of the Destroy Evil. And this is just really hating on the up the beanstalk and preventing them from digging into their wraths. Then bring in the 1 copy of Negate. And if you're not going to change the sideboard at all, this is where you would bring in the 2 copies of the Disdainful Stroke. In my opinion, even though it's not really reflected in the data, because it is Disdainful Stroke is in here for the Domain matchup. One thing that is worth noting, though, is that it's possible that bringing in replacing the Disdainful Strokes with negates would just work better, and this would allow you to, in some cases, use it to prevent the smaller things like the invasion of Zendikar. The Virtue of Persistence, and because Disdainful Stroke has to be of a certain cost, so it's good for like blocking the Leyline Bindings and the Sunfalls, but it does technically let you hit Atraxa, and that's if they don't have the Cavern of Souls, though. So I'd be tempted to bring in 2 copies of Negate over the Disdainful Stroke. And then as far as the cards that we're going to be cutting the Wedding Announcements, Lord Skitter. Making your board really big just makes the token that they get off of the Sunfall even better. And then we're going to bring out the 2 copies of the Dinnick because we don't really need the early pressure or stabilization, and they're not really doing anything with graveyard manipulation. And then we're also going to take out the 2 copies of the Virtue of Loyalty. That one's another one that just like, if we don't have a board and we're not going wide, then why have the board pumper, right? As far as missing options go, yeah, I'll just list them again. The Gix, Yawgmoth, Praetor, Urtai, Malcolm, and Schooner could be interesting options to explore if you wanted to bring them into your sideboard or against Domain. And then potentially replace the Disdainful Strokes or keep them as is. That's up to you. So Tishana's Tidebinder is really good at targeting or negating the enter the battlefield effects or activated or triggered abilities of several of Domain's cards, like I mentioned, Atraxa and Topiary Stomper. And then Lauren of the Third Path comes in and allows us to destroy their up the beanstalks, as well as help us draw into additional cards. So it's a little bit dangerous to give Domain the draw. But if you've got the negates to kind of negate what they're drawing into, and there's a situation where Lauren of the Third Path works well. And then also, Destroy Evil works. We just really want to eliminate up the beanstalk and any card advantage that Domain is going to try to get on us. And then bringing in the 1 copy of the negate and potentially the 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke. And taking out the Wedding Announcements and Lord Skitter. If the opponent's plan is to ramp into a Wrath spell, we don't want to be just building our board into that Wrath. And then Dinnick, Pious Apprentice, and Virtue of Loyalty. We don't need the early stabilization of Dinnick. And Virtue of Loyalty, since we don't have as big a board strategy, we don't need the pump. So I'm still working on this. It's still a little bit of work in progress. I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but maybe what I should do is just to move immediately into the cards talking about them. But anyway, next up, the next most common matchup is Rakdos Midrange. And this one we can see Destroy Evil working particularly well in the Rakdos Midrange matchup. We've got Wedding Announcement, Virtue of Loyalty, Dinnick, Lord Skitter, Fairy Mastermind, Tishana's Tidebinder, Go for the Throat. Cut Down, Make Disappear, Deep Cavern Bat, Raffine, and Lauren of the Third Path. And then we get into that low data problem with the Parasitic Grasp, Knockout Blow, Anoint with Affliction, Negate, Disdainful Stroke, and Acklezot's not having enough data. And then if we look at alternative Esper midrange lists, we can see Destroy Evil is still at the top of the list, and a lot of the same cards that are in Esper midrange already doing quite well against Rakdos midrange, so this seems like a favorable matchup. And then if we look at all archetypes against the Rakdos midrange, we can see Negate at the top of the list, as well as Destroy Evil. So we definitely want to bring in the Destroy Evils and play around with the idea of bringing in the copy of Negate. Now, as well as Anoint with Affliction, as well as number 4 on the list, and then Cut Down coming in near the bottom. So with this, what we can do is we're going to bring in the 3 copies of the Destroy Evil, we're going to bring in the Tidebinder, we're going to bring in the Negate, and if you had replaced the 2 copies of the Disdainful Stroke with Negates, I would bring them in here over the Anoint and the Cut Down. And you know, if you don't want to do the full thing and you want to just you want to keep the Deep Cavern Bats in and not not replace them with Anoint and Cut Down, you know, that's fine too. Like I said, this is just to help you develop a strategy. There are no wrong answers. And but yeah, so our worst cards are Lauren, and then the 4 copies of the Raffine. We don't the conniving into a lethal threat and the card advantage of filtering through with Raffine isn't particularly good against Rakdos midrange because of how good Rakdos midrange is at removing threats with Cut Down and Go for the Throat of their own. So you'll see that you know, pulling the Raffine here is what the data suggests. And then same thing with the Deep Cavern Bat, is just like, since Rakdos midrange has a ton of spot removal, then the Deep Cavern Bat doesn't work particularly well or when, you know, dealing with your opponent's cut downs. And yeah, and then the Disdainful Stroke Negate thing continues. I do think that Negate works a little bit better here than Disdainful Stroke. The whole point here is to be able to, the Destroy Evils and the Negate and the Disdainful Stroke are all here to hate on the cruelty of Gix. And so I guess the Disdainful Stroke does work against the cruelty of Gix, but Negate would also help you protect against some of the spot removal in a pinch if you needed to. So this is another one that makes me want to kind of explore Negate over the Disdainful Stroke. But you could bring it in instead of, you could bring in the 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke over the Anoint and Cut Down. It's just the data doesn't say that, like, for certain that that's a better strategy. Yeah, so the Destroy Evil is really good against the cruelty of Gix. Also really good if they do get something on the board. You know, Trumpeting Carnosaur, things like that. The issue with the cruelty of Gix, though, is if you destroy the Trumpeting Carnosaur, the cruelty of Gix brings it back, and then it, like, cascades into another cruelty of Gix, which then if you destroy the dinosaur, that brings the dinosaur back, and, like, you get this nasty loop in Rakdos midrange. So you want to be blowing up their cruelty of Gix more so than blowing up their stuff and putting it into the graveyard. Tishana's Tidebinder works really well, though, for preventing the discoverability off of the Trumpeting Carnosaur. And then we've got the Negate works really well at countering the cruelty of Gix in the first place. Anoint with Affliction allows you to exile your opponent's early threats that are recurring problems. And then we've got 1 copy of Cut Down, which is good against the other Deep Cavern Bats that you're going to be bumping into. And then bringing out Lauren of the Third Path. This one I thought was kind of interesting, is like, if Destroy Evil is working particularly well to destroy enchantments, then why is Lauren of the Third Path not working particularly well? Because it does enter the battlefield and destroy an enchantment. But I think what it is just, it's a 3-cost card that dies to Cut Down, right? And so, like, I think pulling it makes sense, and then the fact that Destroy Evil can also destroy their large targets makes Lauren of the Third Path kind of just a worse Destroy Evil. And then, like I mentioned, the Raffine Scheming Seer has such a large target on it that it's tempting to bring out in this matchup. And then bringing out 2 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat. And maybe you could bring out all 4 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat if you wanted to follow my sideboard guide, as well as bring in the Disdainful Strokes. So I'll leave that one up to you. And then the next common matchup here is Boros Convoke, and we'll see how long This might just be a spike because it is a new archetype that's being explored in Murders at Karlov Manor. And so this one is the one where they flood the board and try to hit into the Imidane's Recruiter, and you're trying to create so many things that are cheap enough to convoke into the Knight Errant of Eos. So this one's a tough matchup for this deck because we're trying to do this go wide, pump mid-range strategy, and they're doing the same strategy but faster and better well, without as much disruption or spot removal. So top of the list here, we've got Dinnik, which is necessary to help slow down the opponent's gas here. As a 2/3 for 2, it's a nice body, and then the lifelink is very relevant. We've got Go for the Throat to slow down, just like Mono Red. Lord Skitter, Sewer King, which I thought was kind of an interesting one here. There's not a lot of they're not doing anything with their graveyard, but this is more about who wins the race of who gets to build the bigger board faster, right? And so Lord Skitter here, number 3. Rafine, Deep Cavern Bat, Cut Down, Fairy Mastermind, Wedding Announcement, Virtue of Loyalty, and Make Disappear. And then we get into the no data kind of early on this one because this is a new archetype and I have very little data on it. But the Parasitic Grasp, Knockout Blow, Destroy Evil, Lauren of the Third Path, Anoint with Affliction, Negate, Stainful Stroke, Tishana's Tidebinder, and Aclazotz all don't have enough data specifically within this list. So looking at alternative lists, we also don't have very much, but we have a couple of options. So we've got Subterranean Schooner, which as a 3/4 body could work well at blocking your opponent's defenses. The problem with the Boros Convoke is that it goes wide very quickly, and the vehicle doesn't really help you. Playing a turn to create a vehicle can be a good thing early on, but then it doesn't necessarily build the board as well as just playing a body out. So, but it could be it could be an option to explore if the Boros Convoke is here to stay. Urtai Resurrected is an option as well, being able to blow up their Knight Errant of Eos after they already played it. The problem with this is that it's giving them additional cards and card draw. And then we've got Shieldred the Apocalypse, and this is one just like similar to Mono Red. Shieldred can be a nice stabilization because of gaining life every time that you draw a card. So if you draw like 4 or 5 cards off of your wide board, off of a Rafine Conniving, then that's 8 or 10 life from Shieldred. And really help you stabilize in that mid-range. The question is whether or not it's too slow against Boros Convoke. And then another, if we look at all of the archetypes with the Esper Midrange list, kind of help expand our data. We see top of the list here Dinnik and Rafine, but as well as like Anoint with Affliction and the Aclazotz Deepest Betrayal that didn't have enough data before. So with all of this, we can kind of, my suggestion would be to bring in the 1 copy of Cut Down as well as the 1 copy of Anoint with Affliction. Very much like Mono Red, we just want to stabilize against their early pressure. Bring in the Aclazotz, Deepest Betrayal, similar to Mono Red. If we can make it to our 5-drop, then the 4/4 Flying Lifelinker is really great at stabilizing us against their pressure. And then we can cut the 3 copies of the Make Disappear. They just have too many threats, too much of a board flood strategy that like you could try to line up Make Disappear with blocking Knight Errant of Eos, but that's really going to be your one target that you're trying to hit. Is like casting the Make Disappear to just block like the Imidane's Recruiter. I don't think is going to work particularly well in this matchup, and I think the data suggests that it doesn't work particularly well. As far as missing options go, we see some familiar faces along with, like the Schooner and the Urtai and the Shieldred. These are all ones later to think about maybe bringing in if you are personally bumping into a lot of the Boros Convoke. It's nice to know alternative options that you could explore. As far as another card that I think is missing that could be good in this matchup is Knockout Blow. Because of Cut Down and Go for the Throat and Anoint with Affliction, like I think this deck doesn't need the Knockout Blow over, with the point removal that it already has. So again, notably, the Knockout Blow is missing in the data. So I did it again. I talked about why they were all good at that time instead of while the card is up. So I'll get better at that. But yeah, Cut Down here, really good for, help destroy your opponent's early pressure so that you can make it into the mid to late game. Same with Anoint with Affliction, just trying to stall into playing Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal. And yeah, and then as far as and then Make Disappear, bringing out the counter spells, they don't work particularly well in the fast matchup. All right, down the list we've got Bant Toxic is also another one that is a struggle for this deck and is one that you might bump into quite a bit on the ladder. Top of the list we've got Lord Skitter, Sewer King, kind of the same reason for like Boros Convoke, just trying to beat your opponent's pressure before they beat you down. Tishana's Tidebinder, notably Tishana's Tidebinder does not block Toxic, so Toxic is a passive ability, but it does affect the Venerated Rot Priest. So when the Venerated Rot Priest goes off, you can use the Tishana's Tidebinder to block the ability so that they can't just chain off into their Poison Toxic combo. Wedding Announcement to help flood the board like Lord Skitter and race before your opponent gets you with their Toxic. And also just having a bunch of 1/1 tokens to block their 1/1 mites works relatively well. Fairy Mastermind, they don't really have the card draw, but they can struggle with a 2/1 flyer, so just bringing in an additional flyer. Virtue of Loyalty, Make Disappear, Cut Down, Go for the Throat, Rafine, Dinnick, Deep Cavern Bat. And then we get into that low data problem. Parasitic Grasp, Knockout Blow, Destroy Evil, Lorn of the Third Path, Anoint with Affliction, Negate, Disdainful Stroke, and the Aklazot's all have too low data. So if we look at Esper Midrange as a whole, what are some of the cards that we could bring in? Top of the list here is the Wandering Emperor, being able to exile their double striker, 1/1, that sort of thing, works particularly well. And we don't have anything in here that's missing. All of these cards are cards that we already have. Notably like Tishana's Tidebinder on the list here, which we already saw. And then as far as every archetype goes, the top of the list is the Virtue of Loyalty, giving you that flash blocker, can help you, especially because Esper has multiple colors, is particularly good with when you're up against Skrelv, because Skrelv can make a single color not be able to block, so they might be making it so like blue can't block, and then you flash in your 2/2 knight, and then you're able to snipe their 1/1 double striker that was going to hit you for 4 toxic. And then Cut Down here being top of the list. Again, this is just really good at killing their toxic threat, or disrupting Skrelv, killing Skrelv before they can protect things. And then Lord Skitter, Wedding Announcement, some of the cards that we've already seen on the top of the list. So in this matchup, I think that you should bring in the additional copy of Tidebinder to really hate on their Venerated Rot Priests, and take out or bring in a Cut Down so that you have more options against Skrelv and eliminating their early threats. And then as far as the suggested cards to remove, we're going to take out the 2 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat. And Deep Cavern Bat is not particularly good against the Bant Toxic specifically. It's not a good blocker, and the Bant Toxic doesn't actually run a whole lot of spot removal. So Deep Cavern Bat is best when you can remove interaction from your opponent's hand, and then they have to use other interaction to get their interaction back. And Bant Toxic's not really doing that. You can get lucky and hit, disrupt their early plays with the Deep Cavern Bat. So if you don't want to cut the Deep Cavern Bat, you can kind of go back and look at the list and see like, okay, well, what are some of the other low performing options? I think it's worth taking out the Deep Cavern Bat just because if you can survive the early game, you're good against Bant Toxic, and Deep Cavern Bat is not a good blocker, and the lifelink does not matter in this matchup. All right, then we got Dimir Midrange. I'm going to be trying to do the top 8 here, and it might be too much to cut off in one piece, but we're almost there. So Dimir Midrange, we've got Fairy Mastermind, Lord Skitter, Virtue of Loyalty, Wedding Announcement, Dinnick, Make Disappear, Rafine, and Go for the Throat. Then we've got Cut Down, Deep Cavern Bat, Lorn of the Third Path, Tishana's Tidebinder, Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, Destroy Evil, and then Parasitic Grasp, Knockout Blow, Anoint with Affliction, Negate, and Disdainful Stroke don't have enough data. But if we look at alternative options here, we can see one at the top of the list that would be particularly nice to bring in against Dimir Midrange, and that is Urtai Resurrected. And the rest of the options, though, we already have in the list. Notably, a Wandering Emperor is doing relatively well on this one as well. So if you wanted to bring in additional copies of Wandering Emperor, that would always be okay. And then if we look at all archetypes, we can see that Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal does particularly well in this matchup, as well as Destroy Evil and Cut Down. And yeah, and so what I recommend doing is bringing in the one copy of Cut Down and cutting out the one copy of Tidebinder. Now, one thing I do want to point out, and this is one thing that you will bump into whenever you're doing any form of data, is especially with low sample size, is you can end up with contradicting data. So notably here, Aklazot's and Destroy Evil are at the top of the list, right? And if we look at what's performing poorly over here, when I was looking at the list specifically instead of all archetypes, Aklazot's and Destroy Evil are at the bottom of the list. So it could be a small sample issue, but I'm more likely to believe this than I am to believe the all archetypes data. Even though the all archetypes data has more sample size, it doesn't have the sample size specifically from the deck list or from the archetype that I'm looking at, right? So, but you know, if you feel like Aklazot's and Destroy Evil work particularly well against Dimir midrange, then feel free to bring them in here over, say, like a Tidebinder and 2 Deep Cavern Bats. The Destroy Evil does work particularly well against the Dimir midrange. Depending on what the Dimir midrange is running, right? So like Destroy Evil, because you can destroy something with toughness 4 or greater, is an answer against the Schooner, which you are kind of struggling against with you go for the throat, doesn't hit it, and Cut Down doesn't hit it. So Destroy Evil, I think, could be a good one to bring in, but I do want to point out that there is a contradiction in the data. Yeah, so Cut Down, good for removing the early threats like Deep Cavern Bat. And then Tishana's Tidebinder just doesn't have a really great target to hit in Dimir midrange. And the Dimir midrange is a very fast archetype, so it tries to overwhelm you very quickly, where the 3/2 body is understated, and that, similar to like Mono Red and the Boros Convoke, is just, you'd rather have a better blocker. All right, and then last but not least, we've got Golgari midrange. Top of the list here, we've got Dinnik being able to affect their opponents not being able to play from their graveyard. The Lord Skitter, Cut Down, Go for the Throat, Wedding Announcement, Rafine, Fairy Mastermind, Deep Cavern Bat, Virtue of Loyalty, Make Disappear, Tishana's Tidebinder, and Destroy Evil. And then we've got the same low data problem with Parasitic Grasp, Knockout Blow, Warren of the Third Path, Anoint with Affliction, Negate, Disdainful Stroke, and Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal. So if we look at alternative lists here, we can see one option that we've seen a couple of times come up is Urtai Resurrected. The rest of it are cards that are already in the deck. And then as far as every archetype goes, Fairy Mastermind being at the top of the list here. This is largely because Golgari midrange does struggle against the flyers. They have like the ground is gummed up with Glissa and the Mosswood Dread Knights, but the air is relatively open. Lord Skitter does particularly well. Anoint with Affliction, Go for the Throat, Dinnik, Rafine, Make Disappear, and Wedding Announcement. So here we can bring in Cut Down and Anoint with Affliction. Anoint with Affliction is particularly good against Golgari midrange. I talked a little bit about it in my last week's guide to Rakdos midrange about why that deck specifically didn't work very well with Anoint with Affliction. And I bet if I did this same technique that I'm doing this week, that Anoint with Affliction would actually be at the top of the list in all archetypes versus the Rakdos midrange specifically, because of how good Anoint with Affliction is at answering your Mosswood Dread Knights of your opponent. And then Tidebinder here, this is another one that's a very, there's not a whole lot of good targets for Tishana's Tidebinder in the Golgari matchup, and the body having the lower, having the understated body and the, what's the word? Not to your advantage. So I recommend cutting the 2 Tidebinders. And then notably, if you are running the list that has the Urtai Resurrected, this one could be a good one to bring in. So yeah, cut down, being able to just destroy your Mosswood Dread Knights and stall until the later part of the game is good in this matchup, and then anoint for the Mosswood Dread Knight, and Tishana's Tideminder to just, oh, that should be a -2. Yeah, like I mentioned, should be removed. So I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little bit on the timing of this because I keep reading it and then being like, all right. So next week, I'll get good at it eventually here. But I hope it's useful data, and if it is, if it's useful, let me know in the comments. It always makes my day to hear that it actually helped. And leave a like and subscribe and all that fun stuff to help support me in my nonsensical ramblings. And anyway, my overall impressions are, I think we should move the 2 Tidebinders to the sideboard. There's enough matchups where I felt like the Tidebinder was being brought, or was the lowest performing card, and so I would rather start off with the Tidebinder not in the main, and then bring it in when it is a good matchup. But I do think it's good and worth keeping in the list. As I mentioned, and I'll mention it again, I do think that replacing the 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke just with Negate is potentially an improvement to the deck. I know it makes it so that you can't counter non-creature or creature spells that cost 5 or more. Disdainful Stroke hits while Negate does not. I think with the Cavern of Souls, though, that I'd rather just be leaning into the negates. Just personal preference, though. I'd be tempted to remove Knockout Blow. I do know that the matchups that the Knockout Blow is brought in for are the ones that the matchups are kind of struggling against. I think it would be kind of fun to explore 2 copies of Runelurker Bat, especially because Boros Convoke does not have any removal, or is very removal light. This means that we could create a large flying threat with lifelink and potentially outrace them. So I just, again, personal preference, I think I would be exploring sideboarding in 2 Runelurker Bats over the Knockout Blows, especially because we already have a lot of single point interaction that works relatively well against mono red, that we don't necessarily need it. Some lists really need the Knockout Blows. And then Parasitic Grasp, I don't think, I think you bring this one in specifically against like Dennick, or other problematic humans that you want to snipe and gain some life against. The data doesn't suggest anything. It's definitely one that we don't see very often, so I'm not surprised that it's not reflected in the data. So that could be another one to explore removing to something that is reflected in the data, like Shieldred or Tai or Schooner, or something like that, just to have another option to bring in. Because I don't know how often I would actually be bringing in the Parasitic Grasp. So if you have a lot of experience with this deck, please let me know in the comments below if you think like the Parasitic Grasp is a good one, or if you think this was just kind of like a one-of that the tournament winner was exploring for personal reasons. So with that, though, that's going to wrap it up for me, and I'll be back every Friday to do this best of 3 sideboard guide as long as I have the data to do it. Azori Soldiers almost won, so I'm going to put that one back on the list as far as archetypes to explore. One problem, just to say real quick, is that because of the way that I do this, it might not work particularly well for Azori Soldiers, but I'll give it a try and let you know how it goes. And yeah, thanks for being here. Take care, everybody. Remember to place your vote for the next archetype, and I will catch you all next week.